My name is Rachel Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and 3 days before our family trip to Bali, my mother showed up at my front door holding my bank card between two fingers like it was something she didn't want to touch. She didn't come in. She didn't smile. She just stood there under my porch light and said, "They've decided you and Ava won't be coming after all. The kids are more comfortable this way." I remember exactly how she looked when she said it. Beige cardigan. Lipstick too carefully done for a conversation like that. My card pinched in her hand. Like she was returning a library book, not handing back the piece of plastic I had used to pay for almost every part of that trip. Flights from Austin. 5 nights at a resort in Seminyak. Airport transfers. Travel insurance. A driver for 2-day trips. More than $13,000 charged to me because everyone had promised they would settle up later. And behind me, in the next room, my 8-year-old daughter was on the floor, packing and repacking the same little pile of things she had already decided mattered most. Pink sunglasses. A stuffed dolphin. A small notebook with glitter on the cover, because she wanted to write down Bali. For a second, I honestly thought I had heard my mother wrong. I asked her to repeat it. She gave me that look she had used my whole life whenever she wanted me to feel childish for reacting to something cruel. Calm on the surface, slightly tired, like I was about to make an unnecessary scene and inconvenience her with my feelings. She said my sister Vanessa's children didn't want to spend the trip with Ava and me, and since everyone would be together so much, it would be better if we stayed home. Better. That was the word she chose. Not fair. Not sorry. Not difficult. Better. If you've ever been the person your family depends on until the exact moment they decide your feelings are inconvenient, you already know the kind of silence that follows something like that. It isn't loud. It's almost too quiet, like your body is trying to catch up to what your ears just heard. I looked at my mother and asked the only question that made sense. "Are you seriously telling me all of you are still going on the vacation I paid for?" She sighed. Not heavily, just enough to let me know she considered me the problem already. "Rachel, don't start keeping score. Family doesn't work like that." That almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was so clean, so practiced, so perfectly shameless that for one strange second it didn't even feel real. Family didn't work like that when it was my card. My planning, my time off from work, my daughter's excitement, my labor. But I knew, even as she stood there, that if I had tried to pull out of the trip a week earlier, if I had said the charges were too much or I needed reimbursement in advance, suddenly family would have worked very much like that. I took the card from her hand. I remember the plastic felt warm from her fingers. And I said, very calmly, "If my daughter isn't welcome on the trip I paid for, then every dollar is coming back to me." That was the first moment her expression changed. Not dramatically. My mother was not a dramatic woman in public. That was one of the ways she stayed in control. But I saw it. That little flicker in her face when a person realizes the script they expected is no longer being followed. She had expected tears, maybe. A plea. A negotiation. A long, emotional explanation from me about how much this would hurt Ava. Maybe even the old version of me, the one who spent years swallowing things just to avoid making holidays harder. Instead, I just stood there with one hand on the doorframe and the other around my card. She said I was overreacting. I said, "No, this is just the first time I'm reacting at all." For a second I thought she might argue. She opened her mouth like she had more ready. Then she looked past me, maybe listening for Ava, maybe realizing she did not want this conversation overheard, and stepped back. "All right," she said. "If you want to behave like this, that's your choice." Then she turned and walked to her car. I watched her taillights disappear from the driveway, and I stayed standing there a few seconds longer than I needed to, because I knew the next thing I had to do would be the worst part. I had to turn around. I had to go back into my own house and look at my daughter, who still thought her grandmother had stopped by for something ordinary. When I finally closed the door, I could hear Ava humming from her bedroom. She came into the kitchen a second later, wearing one sandal and one sock, which was very on brand for her, and smiled at me like the whole world was still intact. "Did Grandma bring anything?" she asked. "And can I put my dolphin in my backpack now, or is it too early?" There are moments in life where pain is sharp and obvious, and then there are moments where it goes so deep it almost feels clean, quiet, surgical. That was one of those moments. I told her Grandma had just dropped something off and that I needed to finish one quick work thing before dinner. She nodded immediately. No suspicion, no resistance, just trust. That trust nearly undid me. Ava had been looking forward to Bali in a way I hadn't seen since before my divorce. She had counted down on a paper calendar with little purple stars. She had asked me 3 times whether the ocean there looked different from the one in pictures. She had practiced saying thank you and hello in Indonesian on her tablet because she wanted to be polite. She had asked whether the hotel would have mango juice. She had asked if beaches in Bali had crabs. She had asked if sunsets really looked pink. I had let myself believe the trip might be good for us. Not because I thought my family would suddenly transform into kinder people under tropical light. I wasn't that naive anymore, but because I thought distance might help. Neutral ground, warm weather, new memories, something bright after a hard year. I had been divorced for 14 months by then, long enough for the paperwork to be final, not long enough for every part of my life to feel rebuilt. I worked in marketing for a software company in Austin, and from the outside, my life probably looked steady. Good job, clean house, child on time for school, bills paid, hair brushed, calendar managed. Inside my family, though, I had a different role. I was the one who covered things, the one who fixed things, the one who made last-minute reservations, the one who floated a payment, the one who remembered birthdays, insurance forms, airport timing, dietary restrictions, gate changes, doctor names, and who liked aisle seats. Dependable is a flattering word when strangers use it. Inside a family like mine, it can become a job description. I went back to the kitchen and sat down at the table because my legs suddenly felt unsteady. My laptop was still open from work. My coffee was cold. There was a reusable grocery bag on the counter with sunscreen, travel-size shampoo, and 2 new swimsuits I hadn't given Ava yet because I was saving them for the night before our flight. I just stared at that bag. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message in the family group chat. My father, of all people, sending a link about airport arrival times for international travel. Nothing about what had just happened. No acknowledgement. No shame. Just logistics. That told me everything I needed to know. This had been discussed, decided, approved. My mother had simply been chosen to deliver it because she was the one most comfortable calling. Cruelty, practicality. I put my phone face down. Then I picked it back up and scrolled through the messages from the last month. Vanessa saying, "The kids are going to lose their minds when they see the villa." My mother writing, "Thank you again for putting this together, sweetheart. You're always so organized." A thumbs up from Derek. My own messages with flight options, insurance screenshots, transfer details, room confirmations. And buried in there, a message from me 3 weeks earlier asking, "Just confirming everyone's still planning to settle up with me after the trip?" My mother had replied, "Of course. We'll all settle up once we get back." I read that twice, then 3 times. I should have felt shocked, but the truth is, I mostly felt something colder than shock. Recognition. Because this wasn't really new, it was just larger, cleaner, harder to explain away. Vanessa had always known how to take what she wanted and then act offended if anyone named it. My mother had always protected her with language that made selfishness sound like sensitivity. My father had spent most of my life standing 2 feet away from obvious wrongness and calling his silence neutrality. I was the one expected to be reasonable, which usually meant absorb it. Smooth it over. Don't upset the children. Don't make holidays awkward. Don't be dramatic. Don't embarrass the family. My daughter was in her room drawing palm trees she thought she might see in Bali. And something in me finally reached a point it had apparently been walking toward for years. Because this wasn't just an insult to me. This wasn't just one more family slight, one more polished exclusion, one more moment where Vanessa's preferences were treated like law and my child was expected to shrink around them. This was Ava, an 8-year-old little girl being told, through adults too cowardly to say it directly to her face, that she was disposable as long as the plane tickets were still valid. That was the moment the whole thing changed shape in my mind. Up until then, I had still been moving inside the old family logic, hurt, confused, trying to make sense of it, hoping maybe there had been some misunderstanding. There wasn't. There was only a decision. And standing in my kitchen with that screenshot glowing on my phone, I understood that I had 2 choices. I could teach my daughter that when people use your money, your effort, and your loyalty and then push you aside, the mature thing is to stay quiet so everyone else can stay comfortable. Or I could show her something else. I could show her that calm is not surrender. That documentation matters. that being kind and being easy to exploit are not the same thing. That love without respect is not something you owe your silence to. So I stood up, walked to the counter, moved the grocery bag full of beach things out of my line of sight, and opened my contacts. There was only one person I wanted to call: Ethan Reynolds. We had known each other since college. He was one of those rare people who never made me feel foolish for noticing patterns other people preferred to call misunderstandings. He lived downtown now and worked in civil litigation. We didn't talk every day, but he was the kind of friend who answered like he had been expecting you. He picked up on the second ring. And the second he heard my voice, he said, "Rachel, what happened?" I sat back down at the kitchen table with my card still in my hand and looked toward Ava's room, where I could hear her still talking quietly to herself about what she wanted to pack first. Then I told him everything. And by the time I finished, I had the first clear sense that this story was not going to end the way my family thought it would. Ethan did not interrupt me once. That was one of the things I had always trusted about him. He didn't rush to explain my own life back to me. He just listened. The whole time I was talking, I could hear the soft clicking of something in the background, probably him shutting his laptop or moving things off his desk so he could actually focus. When I finished, there was a short pause. Then he asked, "How much did you put on your card?" I told him a little over $13,000. I still remember how strange that number sounded out loud in my own kitchen. Not because I didn't know what I had spent, I knew exactly what I had spent. Flights from Austin during spring travel. 5 nights at a resort that Vanessa had insisted was worth it because this is supposed to be special. Airport transfers for everyone because my mother said she didn't want the stress of figuring things out after a long flight. Travel insurance because Derek had started talking about unpredictable weather and cancellations, and I knew if I didn't add it, somehow that would become my fault too. A private driver for 2-day trips because once I started planning, everyone kept adding just one more thing. That was how it always happened. No one in my family ever asked for huge sacrifices in one dramatic moment. It came in pieces. Small enough that saying yes felt easier than making an issue of it. Cover this now. We'll settle later. Book that too, since you're already doing it. Can you just handle this part? You're so much better at these things. Before long, you were carrying the whole structure, and everyone else had somehow convinced themselves it was natural. Ethan asked one more question. Are they still going? Yes, I said. 3 days from now. He exhaled slowly. Then his tone shifted, just slightly. Not colder. Sharper. It was the voice he used when he stopped being just the person who cared about me and started becoming a lawyer who could see the outline of a problem clearly. "Rachel, this is not just a hurtful family mess," he said. "They asked you to front the cost, excluded you from the trip, and still intend to use what you paid for. That matters." I looked toward Ava's room again. Her door was partly open. I could hear paper moving. She was probably reorganizing that glitter notebook again. I lowered my voice and asked, "What am I supposed to do?" He didn't hesitate. "Save everything. Every receipt. Every booking confirmation. Every text. Every charge. Every message in the family chat. Anything that showed the trip was planned as a shared expense and not a gift." He told me not to argue with anyone that night. Not my mother, not Vanessa, not my father if he suddenly found his phone. He said people start rewriting stories the second they realize there may be consequences, and the worst thing I could do was give them time to test new versions of the truth out loud while I was still upset. That made immediate sense to me, which was almost funny because I had spent years in marketing building campaigns around message control and timing, but I had never once applied that same clarity to my own family. I could see manipulation clearly in a boardroom, in client language, in bad positioning, in vague promises dressed up as strategy. At home, I kept treating the same behavior like personality. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and started going through everything. For almost 2 hours, my kitchen turned into a filing station. I downloaded flight confirmations, took screenshots of the booking breakdown, pulled up the resort invoice, opened my credit card statement and highlighted each charge connected to the trip. Went back through weeks of texts. A pattern started to appear so clearly that I actually had to stop once and press my hand against my forehead. Not because it was confusing, because it was embarrassingly obvious. Vanessa had never once asked what something cost before telling me what would make the trip nicer. She had opinions about room layout, meals, whether the kids should have enough space. Whether the driver could wait during day trips, whether the resort should be closer to the beach. She had all the preferences of a paying guest, and none of the caution. My mother's role had been different. She praised me just enough to keep me moving. Thank you for organizing this. You're such a lifesaver. I don't know what we'd do without you. It sounded affectionate if you didn't know our family. If you did, you understood those weren't compliments. They were maintenance. The verbal equivalent of oiling a hinge so the door keeps opening. My father had contributed almost nothing except one or two practical questions and a thumbs-up reaction, which somehow was very him. A lifetime of hovering just far enough from responsibility that he could later claim he hadn't been involved. And then there was the message I kept returning to. The one where I had written, just confirming everyone's still planning to settle up with me after the trip. And my mother had replied, of course, sweetheart. We'll all settle up once we get back. I took a screenshot of that. Then I emailed it to myself. Then I saved it to a folder on my desktop. Then, because Ethan had told me to be thorough, I uploaded everything to a cloud drive too. At some point, I noticed how absurdly quiet the house had become. Ava had gone to bed without fuss. I had tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and told her I still had a little work to finish. She asked if she could keep the dolphin by her pillow so he doesn't miss the plane when we go. I said yes, and then I stepped out of her room before my face could do something I didn't want her to see. By midnight, the kitchen table was covered in paper. Printouts, notice, receipts, my legal pad from work, my laptop still open to the charge summary. I sat there staring at all of it, and what kept getting to me was not just the amount, it was the assumption. My family had done this because somewhere beneath all the polished language and fake concern, they genuinely believed I would absorb it. That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about. Not that Vanessa was selfish. I had known that for years. Not that my mother would protect the version of events most convenient for Vanessa, also not new. Not even that my father would stay quiet and call it peacekeeping. It was that none of them had seriously factored in the possibility that I might say no. I should probably explain something about my family for this to make full sense. I grew up in a house where usefulness and love were always standing a little too close together. Not openly. My mother would never have said that out loud. She preferred cleaner language than that. She believed in image, in graciousness, in sounding reasonable. But the rules were there. You could feel them. The child who was easiest to display got the most warmth. The child who caused the least inconvenience got the softest version of her. The child who made things run smoothly became responsible for keeping them smooth. Vanessa was younger than me by 3 years, louder than me by nature, and somehow always positioned as the fragile one no matter how aggressively she moved through the world. She was the one whose moods became family weather. If she was upset, everyone adjusted. If she wanted something, there was always some explanation for why it mattered more this time. If she crossed a line, the rest of us were expected to understand what stress she was under. I was the opposite. I learned early that competence makes adults relax around you. If you are the child who remembers details, gets good grades, keeps the peace, says thank you, and doesn't require rescue, people start treating your strength like a public utility. They admire it while assuming it costs you nothing. By the time I was in high school, I was already doing little administrative work for my own family without anyone calling it that, keeping track of dates, reminding my father about forms, helping Vanessa with applications she didn't want to finish, making sure gifts were bought, rides were coordinated, plans were confirmed, nothing dramatic, just enough to build a pattern. And patterns become expectations faster than people realize. The first time I really noticed it as an adult was during my marriage. My ex-husband Mark once told me I was the kind of person who makes life easier for everybody. He meant it as a compliment. At the time, I took it that way. Later, I realized how often that sentence gets handed to women like it's praise, when it's really a warning. Because easier for everybody often means heavier for one person. After the divorce, the pattern got worse, not better. I think my family saw my newly single status as a kind of open capacity. No husband meant flexibility. One child instead of multiple meant fewer complications. Good salary meant I could front things. Responsible job meant I knew how to organize logistics. I worked as senior marketing operations manager for a mid-sized software company. I wasn't running a glamorous life. I wasn't showing up in designer clothes or talking about stock options over dinner. But I was stable, solid, dependable. To my family, stability looked like availability. That was one of the reasons nobody had ever really asked much about my work. They knew enough to reduce it to a sentence. Rachel does something in tech marketing. My mother said it sometimes with a tone that suggested I arranged fonts for a living. Vanessa liked to call it spreadsheet wizardry whenever she wanted to make a joke. The truth was, I managed complex campaigns, budget forecasting, vendor relationships, rollout timelines, performance reporting, and cross functional planning across teams that routinely missed deadlines until I forced clarity into the room. My entire professional life was built around getting facts straight, documenting commitments, and catching gaps before they turned expensive. At work, that made me valuable. At home, it made me useful. There's a difference. The next morning, Ethan came by before work with coffee in both hands and a yellow legal pad tucked under his arm. He looked tired, and I knew instantly he had stayed up later than he should have, thinking about my situation. That nearly got me more than anything else. Cruelty hurts, obviously, but there is something uniquely disorienting about being treated with quiet care right after someone else has treated you like you don't matter. It throws the contrast into painful focus. Ava had already left for school, which I was grateful for. I did not want her hearing the details. Ethan sat down at my kitchen table, looked over the receipts and screenshots, and walked through everything with that measured calm he always had when he wanted me to stop spiraling and start thinking clearly. He said we had two possible paths. The first was a written reimbursement demand. Simple, direct, documented. No emotional language. Just facts, amount owed, and a deadline. The second, if they refused or tried to recast the money as a gift, was a civil claim. I asked him which one he thought this would become. He took a sip of coffee, looked down at my mother's text, then back at me. Rachel, decent people don't remove an 8-year-old from a trip she's been excited about for weeks and still plan to use the services her mother paid for. Let's not build our strategy around decency suddenly appearing. That settled something in me. Not because it was harsh, because it was clear. So we drafted the message together. I kept it clean. I stated that because I had been informed Ava and I were no longer included in the Bali trip, I was requesting reimbursement for the full amount I had paid toward flights, accommodations, transportation, insurance, and trip-related services. I included the total. I gave a 14-day deadline. I said payment arrangements could be sent in writing. That was it. No accusation. No history lesson. No mention of my daughter crying into her pillow. No mention of how humiliating it felt to be cut out of a vacation I financed. No mention of the years of being the one who was expected to carry things quietly. Just the facts. Ethan read it twice and nodded once. Send it to your mother, he said. Not the group, not Vanessa. Let the response come from the person who made herself the messenger. I sent it. And then I felt that strange hollow drop in my stomach that comes right after a line has been crossed and can't be uncrossed. The response came in less than 5 minutes. My mother wrote a long message that somehow managed to sound offended, superior, and morally wounded all at once. She said the money had been offered freely. She said it was hurtful and selfish to turn a family trip into a financial dispute. She said I was reducing a beautiful memory to transactions. Then she added, with the kind of cruelty that only looks subtle on the surface, that maybe I should think carefully about the example I was setting for Ava. I read that once, then again, and then the line that followed made my hands actually go cold. She wrote, "If Ava made the other children uncomfortable, perhaps you should spend less time blaming others and more time reflecting on your own parenting." I just stared at the screen. There are insults adults throw at each other all the time. Some are low, some are ugly, some are strategic. But dragging a child into your attempt to shame her mother is a different kind of line, especially when that child has done nothing except trust you. I handed the phone to Ethan. He read the message slowly. His face didn't change much at first, but when he reached that line about Ava, I saw his jaw tighten. He set the phone down carefully. "Save that," he said. Every word. Before I could even answer, another message came through. Vanessa. No surprise there. She skipped the moral language and went straight to contempt. She said I was being petty. She said the trip wasn't all about me. She said her kids deserved a peaceful vacation without drama. Then she wrote the sentence that explained more than she meant to. "You always find a way to play the victim when you're not the center of attention." Ethan looked up as soon as I read it aloud. There it was. Not concern. Not logistics. Not the children in any real sense. Resentment. That old familiar resentment Vanessa had carried for years whenever competence, consistency, or trust gathered around me in ways she couldn't control. It explained things I hadn't fully named before. The small digs over the years. The eye rolls whenever our parents praised me for something practical. The way she treated help from me like an entitlement, but any attention given to me like a threat. She didn't just want the trip, she wanted the version of the story where I funded it and disappeared from it cleanly. I should have cried then. Instead, I got very still. Very calm. The kind of calm that doesn't mean peace. The kind that means a decision has finally locked into place. I looked at Ethan and said, "I'm done asking them to treat me fairly." He nodded once, like he had been waiting for me to arrive there on my own. Then he pulled the legal pad closer, uncapped his pen, and started outlining the next steps. And sitting there at my kitchen table with my mother's message saved, my sister's contempt in writing, and that yellow legal pad between us, I understood something I should have understood years earlier. They had mistaken my restraint for permission. That mistake was about to become expensive. We filed the claim that same week. Even now, that sentence feels cleaner than the reality did. In reality, it was forms and dates and scanned copies and one printer jam that nearly made me throw the whole machine into the yard. It was Ethan sitting across from me at my kitchen table with his sleeves rolled up, asking for one more confirmation, one more screenshot, one more booking receipt. It was me signing my name in 3 different places while trying to steady a hand that wasn't shaking from doubt so much as from adrenaline. I had never sued anyone before. Certainly not my own family. There is something deeply unnatural about seeing people you grew up with reduced to legal categories. Claimant, defendant, supporting documentation, service address. It strips away all the fog they usually live inside. All the old language. All the emotional static. It turns years of manipulation into something much simpler. Who paid? Who agreed? Who benefited? Who excluded whom? What proof exists? I think that was part of why they panicked so quickly once the paperwork became real. Families like mine survive on vagueness, tone, implication, history. The moment you force them into specifics, they start losing air. The claim itself was simple enough. I had paid for a shared family trip on the explicit understanding that I would be reimbursed. Ava and I were then excluded from that trip 3 days before departure. The others still used the flights, accommodations, transportation, and services I had booked. They refused reimbursement. The documentation showed all of it. It looked almost insultingly clear on paper, which made me angry in a new way. Because if it was this clear now, then what exactly had I spent so many years doing? Translating their behavior into softer language, mostly, cleaning up reality until it was easier to live with, calling selfishness stress, calling cowardice conflict avoidance, calling favoritism family complexity, calling my own hurt sensitivity so I wouldn't have to admit how often I had been treated as less important. Once I stopped doing that, the whole thing sharpened fast. Ethan told me early on that my biggest advantage was going to be restraint. "Don't chase them," he said. "Don't defend yourself in 6 directions. Don't try to educate people who are invested in misunderstanding you. Let the evidence do its job." That was harder than it sounded. Not because I wanted to change their minds. By then I was past that. What I wanted, embarrassingly enough, was for someone in that family to pause long enough to feel real shame. To say, clearly and without rearranging it, "We did something ugly. We hurt Ava. We used you. We were wrong." But that kind of honesty would have required them to value truth more than hierarchy. And my family had never chosen truth over comfort if comfort belonged to the right person. My mother was served first, not in some dramatic public scene, not at church, not in front of neighbors, not during one of Vanessa's carefully staged social moments, just on an ordinary weekday outside her house. Ethan texted me once it was done. Served. That was all he wrote. I stared at the word longer than I expected to. Then I put my phone down and went back to the campaign report I had been reviewing for work because I refused to let that moment become some cinematic event in my own head. I was at my desk in the home office, wearing a navy sweater and reading through quarterly pipeline numbers, while my family's first real consequence was already moving toward them in a sealed envelope. Less than an hour later, my phone started lighting up. Vanessa first. 6 calls in 11 minutes. Then Derek. Then my father. Then 2 messages in the family group chat, both immediately deleted, which only told me people were already arguing about wording and audience. I did exactly what Ethan had told me to do. Nothing. I let every call ring out. I let every notification sit there unread for a while. I made tea. I answered a work email. I switched the laundry. I opened my calendar and moved Ava's dentist appointment to the next week. It felt surreal, doing ordinary things while I knew panic was spreading through the family like heat through wiring. Eventually, I read the messages. Vanessa's first text said, "Have you completely lost your mind?" Her second said, "You are humiliating all of us over a misunderstanding." By the fourth, the tone had changed from outrage to threat. She wrote that if I kept going, I would destroy the family permanently, which was revealing in its own way, not because it scared me, because it told me she understood, at least instinctively, that families like ours are often held together not by love, but by one person's willingness to keep absorbing damage quietly. My father's message was shorter. I wish I could say that made it better. It didn't. He wrote, "This is not how decent people handle private matters." That was classic him. No acknowledgement of what had actually happened, no naming of the exclusion, no mention of Ava. Just a general principle dropped into the middle of a very specific wrongdoing, as if moral fog itself might save him from having to pick a side he had already picked in practice. I didn't answer him either. The family group chat went almost completely dead after that. No packing updates. No restaurant links. No airport timing questions. No one asking whether everyone had passport copies. The silence was interesting, not peaceful, not accidental, strategic. For the first time since the Bali plan came together, everyone understood that they could no longer float through the trip pretending this was just a small, emotional disagreement that would smooth over on its own. Now there were filings, deadlines, evidence, a version of events outside the family's control. And the person who had introduced that version was me. That did something to the hierarchy immediately. I won't pretend the silence was easy. There is a certain kind of conditioning that lives in your body long after you think you've outgrown it. Mine was the instinct to rush in and make things manageable before they spread. Clarify, explain, reduce the discomfort, offer a softer version, find the wording that lets everyone calm down without ever fully confronting what happened. That instinct flared hard those first few days. Every time my phone rang, some old part of me wanted to answer and say, "Let's just sort this out. Let's keep this from becoming worse." But worse had already happened. Worse had happened on my porch when my mother used the phrase "less stressful" to describe excluding my daughter from a trip I had financed. Worse had happened when my sister used her own children as cover for her resentment. Worse had happened when my father decided humiliation mattered only once it was happening to the family's image instead of to me. So I kept choosing silence. Not wounded silence. Not passive silence. Purposeful silence. A silence that said, "I will not rescue you from the consequences of what you chose clearly and with time to reconsider." Ava still didn't know the full story. That remained the hardest part. I told her the trip had fallen through because of a family issue and that I was working on something important. She looked disappointed, obviously, but children are often gentler with adult pain than adults are. She studied my face for about 2 seconds, then nodded in that serious little way she had when she sensed a situation was bigger than she could understand. "Maybe Bali was too far anyway," she said. I had to turn away under the pretense of rinsing a dish because that sentence nearly broke me. Later that evening, I found her folded paper countdown tucked into the drawer beside the refrigerator, purple stars and all. She had put it away without being asked. That was when I felt the anger change shape. Before that, it had still been hot, personal, bright. After that, it became colder, more useful. Because what my family had done had not just disappointed my daughter, it had made her smaller in her own home for a moment. It had made her sense, correctly, that something painful was happening around her and that the easiest way to help was to become less visible. There was no version of motherhood in which I was going to let that lesson stand. 3 days later, they left for Bali anyway. That part stripped away whatever sentimental residue I had left. Any tiny corner of me that still believed guilt might stop them, that some last-minute conscience might emerge once suitcases were actually being zipped and passports were actually being checked. No. They still went. They still got on the plane. They still checked into the resort. They still used the transfers. They still ate dinners and booked excursions and stood in tropical light, smiling like nothing rotten sat underneath any of it. I didn't have to go searching for proof of that. It found me. My cousin Lauren called from Dallas on the second day of their trip. Lauren and I had never been especially dramatic with each other. That was part of why I trusted her. She wasn't one of those relatives who lived to relay mess under the excuse of concern. She called because she had heard enough through the grapevine to know something serious had happened, and unlike most of the family, she was smart enough to assume the first version reaching her probably favored the loudest people. When I told her what had actually happened, she went very quiet. Then she said, "Rachel, that's disgusting." A few hours later, she sent me screenshots from Vanessa's Instagram stories. I should not have opened them. I knew that. I opened them anyway. There they all were. My mother smiling into a camera near a pool lined with white umbrellas. Vanessa in a white cover-up holding a drink with a flower in it. Derek in mirrored sunglasses. The kids grinning over tropical mocktails. One sunset photo from the beach with a caption about making memories. I looked at each image only once, but one of them stayed with me. There was a small table in the corner of a resort photo set up for the children, bright drinks, shell bracelets, little plates of fruit cut into shapes. Exactly the kind of thing Ava would have loved with her whole heart. At that exact moment, my daughter was in our living room on the rug working on a puzzle and asking me whether we still had popsicles. I sat there with my phone in my hand and felt something lock into place permanently. They were not conflicted. They were not privately ashamed. They were not struggling their way through a difficult family decision. They were enjoying themselves. Good. Let them. Let them smile in those photos and put timestamps on their own selfishness. Let them enjoy the full comfort of what they had decided to take. Every picture, every caption, every visible use of what I had paid for made the story simpler, cleaner, harder for them to muddy later. I sent the screenshots to Ethan. His reply came back fast. Good evidence. Save originals too. That became our rhythm for a while. Me forwarding screenshots, messages, voicemails, him answering with practical instructions. Save this. Screenshot with timestamp. Don't engage. Archive everything. We were building a case, yes, but we were also doing something else. We were removing oxygen from the family's preferred version of reality. The waiting after that was the worst part. People think the dramatic moment is the hardest. The filing, the serving, the confrontation. Sometimes it is. But there is a different kind of pressure in the weeks after, when nothing visible is happening and yet everything is changing shape underneath you. No one from my immediate family checked on Ava. No one asked how I was. No one attempted anything resembling an apology. The only outreach came when they wanted something. My mother left one voicemail halfway through the trip, using that careful, controlled tone she relied on whenever she wanted to sound reasonable for the record. She said she hated what this had become. She said she hoped I would find a way to calm down before permanent damage was done. She said the family was deeply hurt. Not once did she mention what had been done to me. Not once did she say Ava's name. I forwarded the voicemail to Ethan and deleted it from my inbox. The people who actually showed up during that period were the ones with nothing to gain from me. Lauren kept checking in. Ethan came by more than once with takeout under the excuse of updating me on next steps, though by then I think both of us understood that part of what he was doing was making sure I had eaten something that wasn't coffee and panic. One evening, he sat at my kitchen counter, helping Ava build a model volcano for school while I stood at the sink rinsing dishes I had already rinsed twice. He took her seriously in that easy way good adults do with children. Not performative, not overly sweet, just present. "Do you think real lava moves fast?" she asked him. "Fast enough to ruin your afternoon," he said gravely, and she laughed so hard she almost knocked over the glue. I remember standing there, hands wet, watching the two of them and thinking how strange it is that kindness can look so ordinary when it's real. No speeches, no performance, no power games. Just showing up, paying attention, being careful with someone else's small heart. Somewhere in the middle of all that waiting, I stopped mourning the family I thought I had. Or maybe not stopped. Maybe I just got tired of offering it fresh language every day. And just when I thought the worst of their audacity had already passed, Vanessa left me a voicemail that made it clear they were a lot more afraid of losing in court than they had ever been of losing me. Vanessa left the voicemail on a Sunday night, right after I got Ava into bed. I almost deleted it when I saw her name. By then I had heard enough from my family to know that none of them were suddenly calling to tell the truth, but something in me wanted to hear how she would package it. What version of concern she would build now that paperwork existed and a court date was no longer theoretical. So I listened. Her voice was softer than usual, measured, almost careful, the way people sound when they know anger won't help them and they're trying on reason instead. She said things had gotten out of hand. She said this was becoming unnecessary. She said family should not be dragged into court over a misunderstanding. Then she got to the real point. She said that if I handled this the right way, maybe Ava could still come to Logan's birthday next month. I remember sitting very still on the couch with my phone in my hand, staring at the dark television screen while her voice kept talking. My daughter had been cut out of an international trip I paid for. My child had spent days believing a dream had simply fallen through. My family had gone anyway. And now Vanessa was offering a birthday invitation like it was diplomatic leverage. That message told me more than any angry text had. Anger can be messy. Fear is cleaner. People do not suddenly reach for soft language and conditional peace offerings when they think they are in the right. They do it when they can feel the ground shifting under them. I sent the voicemail to Ethan. He called me within 5 minutes. "Don't respond," he said immediately. I wasn't planning to. Good. Then he paused and added, in the calmest tone possible, "People don't beg like that when they think they're going to win." That settled me more than anything else had. Not because I needed revenge. By then, I was past wanting some dramatic emotional collapse from them. What I wanted was clarity in a room where their usual habits wouldn't work. A place where no one cared who was louder, who was more offended, who was just trying to keep the peace, or who had spent years training everyone else to work around their moods. I wanted facts in front of people who had no emotional investment in protecting Vanessa. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning downtown. I barely slept the night before. It wasn't panic exactly, more like my body refusing to fully relax because it knew something important was coming and didn't trust itself to miss it. I got up twice to check that Ava's overnight bag was packed for Lauren's house, once to make sure I had my folder. Once because I thought I had forgotten to print a screenshot that was already sitting in the folder exactly where it belonged. By 6 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and got dressed. Navy blouse, black slacks, low heels I could actually walk in, hair pulled back, minimal makeup. I wanted to look like myself on my most composed day. Not fragile, not theatrical, not as if I had dressed for battle. Ethan picked me up just after 7 with coffee in one hand and the same calm expression he seemed able to manufacture even in situations that should have rattled normal people. On the drive downtown, Austin looked strangely ordinary. Traffic on Mopac, brake lights, early sun on glass buildings, a food truck already open near a corner I passed all the time. It was unsettling, in a way, how normal the world looked when your private life was about to be laid out in a courtroom. Ethan didn't fill the car with strategy talk. That was one of the reasons I was grateful he was the one beside me. He knew when information helped and when it just turned into noise. He only said 2 things. Stick to facts. And then, a few minutes later, don't help them explain themselves. That second sentence stayed with me. When we pulled into the parking garage and walked toward the courthouse, I felt oddly steady. Not confident. Not calm in any dramatic sense. Just clear. Clearer than I had been in years. My mother, father, Vanessa, and Derek were already there. Of course they were. My mother was wearing a pale blue blazer and carrying a leather tote, as if this were some distasteful appointment she was attending under protest. Vanessa looked angry in that tightly controlled way she had when she wanted to appear composed but couldn't quite contain the insult of being challenged. Derek looked irritated and underprepared. My father was the same as always when things became morally inconvenient, quiet, slightly gray around the eyes, looking like a man who hoped posture alone might excuse silence. For one moment, all 4 of them turned toward me at once. That was the strangest part. Not seeing them. Seeing them see me. Because I could tell immediately they had expected something different. Maybe they thought I would look rattled. Maybe they expected tears, hesitation, shame. Maybe they believed that once it all became real, I would finally start behaving like the version of me they preferred, apologetic for making consequences visible. Instead, I just stayed beside Ethan and kept walking. My mother took 1 half step forward. "Rachel." Ethan didn't even break stride. "She's not discussing the case outside the courtroom," he said. We walked past them. No scene, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation in the hall, just one clean boundary. Inside, the room was smaller than people imagine when they hear the word courtroom. No polished television grandeur. Just wood, fluorescent light, rows of seating, and the particular kind of institutional stillness that makes even loud people lower their voices. I sat beside Ethan and placed my folder on the table in front of me. He had organized everything with tabs: booking confirmations, card charges, massage, screenshots, insurance records, travel arrangements, Instagram posts from Bali. It all looked so controlled and ordinary there in neat stacks, which was somehow one of the most satisfying parts. My family had built so much of their power on confusion, on emotional fog, on making every injury sound interpersonal and therefore debatable. But printed documents don't care about emotional tone. Dates don't care who in the family is more charming. Screenshots don't shift because someone sighs and says, "That's not what I meant." When the hearing started, Ethan kept it simple. That mattered. He didn't perform. He didn't try to turn my life into a speech. He just laid out the sequence clearly. I had paid for a shared family trip on the understanding that I would be reimbursed. The messages showed that. I was excluded, along with my daughter, 3 days before departure. The messages showed that too. The remaining family members still used the services I had paid for. The photographs and booking records confirmed it. I requested reimbursement in writing. It was refused. Instead, I received messages attempting to reclassify the money as a gift after the fact. That was it. Just facts. Their attorney tried to argue what I already knew they would argue: that the money had been offered freely, that no formal repayment schedule had been established, that families often make informal arrangements, that this was a painful misunderstanding made worse by emotion. A misunderstanding. It was almost impressive how often adults use that word when they want to place fog over something they understood perfectly well while benefiting from it. Ethan didn't rush in. He waited. Then he pointed to the messages. My message: "Just confirming everyone's still planning to settle up with me after the trip." My mother's response: "Of course, sweetheart. We'll all settle up once we get back." Then another message discussing cost sharing. Then another confirming arrangements. Then the reimbursement request after Ava and I were excluded. Then my mother's written refusal. Then Vanessa's messages. Then the Bali screenshots. He didn't need outrage. The sequence was doing all the work. The judge asked a few questions. Mostly practical ones at first. Who booked the flights? I did. Whose card was charged? Mine. Did the other family members use the flights, accommodations, and transportation after the claimant and her daughter were excluded? Yes. Then the judge turned to my mother. I will never forget that moment. Not because it was dramatic, because it was so plain. He asked whether there had been an understanding that I would be repaid by the other travelers for the trip expenses. My mother tried to soften immediately. She said there had been conversations. She said family arrangements are often informal. She said emotions had escalated. She said she believed Rachel. She actually said Rachel, not my daughter, which told me she was already trying to create distance, had later changed the meaning of what was intended. The judge let her finish. Then he asked again, more directly this time. Was there an understanding that she would be paid back? There was a short pause. It wasn't long in clock time, maybe 2 seconds, 3. But in a room like that, where everybody knows a clean answer is required and cannot be padded forever, a pause becomes very visible. My mother glanced once toward their attorney. Then she said, "Yes." That was it. One word. No one gasped. No one turned dramatically. Nothing cinematic happened. But I felt the air change. Because that one word took away the architecture they had been hiding inside, the gift argument, the confusion argument, the family misunderstanding argument. All of it collapsed under that single admission. Yes. I didn't look at Vanessa, but I could feel her anger from where I sat. It was almost physical, not grief, not regret, rage. The rage of a person watching the story stop belonging to her. After that, the rest moved quickly. The judge noted the written evidence, the exclusion, the continued use of the booked services, and the prior understanding that repayment was expected. He ruled in my favor for the full amount plus court costs. I had imagined that if I ever heard those words, I would feel triumphant. I didn't. What I felt was release. A long exhale I had apparently been holding for years. Not because the money fixed the deeper thing. It didn't. It couldn't. A ruling does not give your daughter back the trip she lost. It does not erase the image of a little folded countdown sheet in a kitchen drawer. It does not make a grandmother kinder or a sister less petty or a father braver. But it does something else. It places reality in the open and says, this happened, and it was wrong. Sometimes that matters more than people who come from healthy families understand. Outside the courtroom, nobody came over to me. My mother stayed close to their attorney, face set in that frozen expression she wore whenever public dignity mattered more to her than truth. My father kept his eyes down. Derek looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Vanessa looked furious, but not shocked. I think by then she knew exactly what had happened. She just hated that it had happened in a place where charm, resentment, and family hierarchy couldn't save her. Ethan and I walked toward the parking lot in silence. Only once we were inside the garage did he look over at me and ask, "You okay?" I stood there with the folder still in my hand, the morning already warm around us, and thought about how to answer. "I don't know yet," I said. And that was the truth, because winning and healing are not the same thing. But I knew one thing clearly enough to say it out loud. My family spent my whole life counting on my silence. Ethan waited. I looked back toward the courthouse doors and said, "Today it cost them." And even then, standing there with the ruling behind me and the money already legally on its way back, I still didn't understand that the biggest change wasn't going to be in them. It was going to be in me. They paid me back, but not with any grace. My mother sent her portion first. No note, no acknowledgement, just the transfer and a cold line in the memo field that read reimbursement, as if reducing the whole thing to one neutral word might wash her hands of it. My father covered more than I expected, which told me immediately that Vanessa and Derek either couldn't or wouldn't come up with their full share right away. Vanessa sent hers last, in smaller payments stretched out just enough to make the process feel deliberate. A final irritation. A last attempt at control. By then, it didn't land the way she probably wanted it to. The court had already given me something bigger than the money. It had taken their version of the story away from them. That mattered more than I can fully explain unless you've lived inside a family that survives by editing reality after the fact. They could still call me difficult in private. They could call me dramatic. They could call me cold. They could tell distant relatives some cleaner, flatter version where I had overreacted and turned a hurt feelings situation into a legal issue. But they had lost the right to define what happened in any room that cared about facts. And after years of being treated like the stable one who was supposed to absorb and smooth and quietly endure, that felt like oxygen. The silence that followed became permanent faster than I expected. My mother stopped calling. My father never reached out directly again. Vanessa blocked me on everything, which honestly saved me the trouble of doing it myself. For a while, that silence hurt in a dull, physical way. Not because I missed the chaos. I didn't. And not because I wanted an apology. By then, I understood that any apology from them would almost certainly come wrapped in self-protection and selective memory. What hurt was the finality of seeing the structure clearly. I had spent most of my life earning my place in a family that only valued me when I was useful. The second usefulness was no longer available on demand. The relationship itself collapsed. That clarity is painful at first. Then, if you let it, it becomes freeing. There was no more guessing after that. No more trying to decode whether my mother really meant that comment the way it sounded. No more asking myself if Vanessa's latest cruelty was stress, insecurity, or just another miscommunication. No more waiting for my father to suddenly become the kind of man who could say, "This was wrong, and I won't stand beside it." The waiting was over. All that remained was choice. I chose distance. Not the dramatic kind, not a big announcement, not a speech, not a social media quote about boundaries and peace. Just a set of quiet, practical decisions repeated consistently until they became my life. I stopped answering unknown emotional hooks. I stopped attending gatherings where I would be expected to pretend. I stopped translating cruelty into softer language so other people could stay comfortable. I stopped explaining to people who had already shown me they preferred me confused. I blocked where I needed to block. Ignored what needed ignoring. Kept records where records mattered. And then, little by little, I turned toward the life that was actually mine. Ava adjusted faster than I did. That sounds sad when I say it out loud, but children are often more honest about love than adults. Once the trip was no longer a possibility, once the calls stopped, once the background static of my family faded from our daily life, she stopped asking about them as much as I thought she would. Not immediately. At first, she still asked small questions. Are we seeing Grandma at Christmas? Is Logan still having his birthday? Did Aunt Vanessa get home from Bali? I answered gently, and as simply as I could. Then those questions became less frequent. Not because she had stopped caring altogether, because children eventually stop reaching toward doors that never open kindly. They adapt. They protect themselves in small, quiet ways adults often miss unless they are paying attention. What I noticed instead was what replaced the old energy. Our house got lighter. Not all at once, and not in some fake movie montage where trauma disappears because the lighting changes. It was subtler than that. Dinner without my phone buzzing with just one quick thing. Weekends that were not quietly arranged around someone else's emotional weather. School nights where my attention was actually on Ava instead of on family logistics. Holidays that felt smaller but cleaner. Silence that no longer meant punishment. There is a deep exhaustion that comes from constantly anticipating where the next little cut will come from. Once that anticipation left our house, I realized how much space it had been taking up. Ethan stayed. Not in some dramatic, sweeping way. That is not his style, and by then it wasn't mine either. He just kept showing up. He came by after work, sometimes with tacos or Thai food or whatever he had picked up on the way because he was in the area, which was almost never true. He took Ava to get frozen yogurt after her swim lessons. He helped her build another science project that somehow involved baking soda and a cardboard ecosystem. He sat at my kitchen table and listened on the harder nights without trying to turn my pain into a lesson before I was ready. That last part mattered more than I expected. A lot of people think support means advice, or optimism, or pushing you quickly toward the bright side because your grief makes them uncomfortable. Ethan never did that. If I was angry, he let me be angry. If I was tired, he didn't ask me to perform resilience. If I was quiet, he didn't fill every silence just to make himself feel useful. He was careful with both of us, and after everything I had lived through, that carefulness felt more intimate than grand speeches ever could. Ava trusted him long before I let myself name what was happening. One night, maybe 4 months after the case ended, we were eating takeout at the table and Ethan had stepped out to take a call. Ava was drawing on the back of an old grocery list, completely focused, and without looking up she said, "Good. It feels happier when he's here." I remember going still. Not because the sentence was dramatic, because it was so simple, so accurate. Children almost always tell the truth before adults are ready for it. I didn't answer right away. She glanced up and added, very casually, "He listens all the way." I knew exactly what she meant. That was one of the first nights I let myself stop treating my life like something that had only recently survived damage and start seeing it as something that was actively becoming whole in a new way. About a year after the ruling, Lauren called me after a barbecue on my father's side of the family. She said she had heard something and thought I deserved to know. By then, I wasn't hungry for information the way I had been in the beginning. I didn't need updates to move forward, but Lauren was not a gossip. If she was calling, there was a reason. The truth was uglier than I expected, and somehow still less surprising than it should have been. Logan and Harper had not asked to exclude Ava. Not really. Vanessa had been the one shaping that idea long before the trip, telling her children that Ava was too sensitive, that I always made things about me, that I would probably bring stress into the vacation. She had used her own children as cover because it sounded softer than admitting what was actually driving her. Jealousy. Not over one single thing. Over the role I occupied without trying to. I was the one people trusted with details, the one people called when things needed to be handled, the one who stayed standing after my divorce, the one who kept functioning, the one who, without making a show of it, had built a stable life she couldn't discredit as easily as she wanted. Hearing that should have reignited something in me. Instead, it made me feel finished. Because by then, I no longer needed Vanessa to confess who she was. I had receipts, court records, years of pattern, and a child who had already moved on towards something healthier. Whether jealousy had been the engine or not didn't change the outcome. It only confirmed that I had been right not to keep offering myself up for further explanation. The truth had already done its work. What mattered now was what I chose to build next. So I chose peace. Not the fake peace I had mistaken for maturity most of my life. Not appeasement. Not self-erasure with a soft smile. Real peace. Distance. Consistency. A home where my daughter did not have to wonder whether love could disappear when someone else got uncomfortable. A life built around people who had shown up when it was inconvenient, not only when it benefited them. And then, about a year and a half after the court case, Ethan and I took Ava to Bali for real. That part still feels almost impossible when I hold it beside the first version of the story. The three of us at the airport before sunrise. Ava, older now, taller, carrying a small backpack covered in pins she had chosen herself. Her excitement steadier than before, less frantic, more grounded. The same stuffed dolphin tucked into the side pocket because some things deserve a second chance too. We stayed in a different part of Bali than the original trip. Not because I was trying to reclaim the exact thing that had been taken. I wasn't. I had learned by then that healing is not reenactment. It's replacement. It's choosing something new that belongs fully to the life you have now. On our first evening there, we stood on the beach at sunset. The sky really was pink. Ava had her sandals in one hand and was letting the water run over her feet with that look children get when reality turns out to be even better than the picture they built in their heads. Ethan was beside me, quiet, not trying to narrate the moment into meaning. Then Ava looked up at me and said, "This feels better than I imagined." I think that was the exact moment I understood the whole story properly. The real loss had never been the vacation. It was the illusion that the people who hurt us were the only family we had. They weren't. Family is not just shared blood and old photographs and obligations nobody ever questions. Family is the people who protect your child, the people who tell the truth when lying would be easier, the people who stay when staying is inconvenient, the people who do not require your humiliation in exchange for belonging. I used to think keeping the peace made me strong. Now I know better. Protecting your child is strength. Walking away from people who keep wounding you is strength. Letting facts speak when you've spent a lifetime being told to soften them is strength too. And maybe the hardest lesson of all was this. Losing the wrong people can feel like grief at first, because your body confuses familiarity with safety. But if you stay still long enough and tell yourself the truth without editing it, grief makes room for something cleaner. Dignity. Relief. Choice. Ava doesn't remember every detail of that first canceled trip now. She remembers pieces, the pink sunglasses, the countdown sheet, the disappointment. Kids do that. They keep what they need and let the rest go if the adults around them build something safer afterward. What she remembers most clearly, I think, is what came next. That we left. That we built differently. That love in our house stopped feeling conditional. That the people who stayed in our lives were the people who treated her like she mattered. That matters to me more than any ruling ever could. If there is a lesson in all of this, it isn't that courts fix families. They don't. It isn't even that truth always produces apology. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people would rather lose money, access, and relationships than surrender the story they tell themselves about why they were entitled to hurt you. The lesson is smaller and more useful than that. You do not have to keep protecting people from the consequences of what they are choosing clearly. You do not have to call cruelty confusion just because it comes from family. And you do not have to stay where respect is always negotiable. Sometimes the most important thing a mother can do is show her child that being chosen matters. That being included matters. That calm does not mean surrender. That love without respect is not love you're supposed to beg for. I used to think my role in the family was to carry whatever they dropped and call it loyalty. Now I think loyalty looks very different. It looks like telling the truth. It looks like closing the door. It looks like keeping your daughter close while she sleeps with a stuffed dolphin under her arm and building a life where no one gets to make her feel like an inconvenience again. That was the real ending. Not the ruling, not the money, not even Bali. The real ending was that my daughter learned, by watching me, that when people show you exactly how little they value your heart, you are allowed to leave and build somewhere kinder. And sometimes that is the beginning of everything.